All right, so why did the United States ever achieve the status of, the big kid on campus? Why are we the world order, the current world order? Is it because there's just something inherently better about being American? No, right? Like one human being is not better or worse than another human being. We're all people. And so what is it? Like what happened historically? What steps happened? And is this something that's repeatable that we can see? Well, the answer is yes. So the United States established the American world order in 1944, right after World War II. This happened in the Bretton Woods Agreement. Okay, so following World War II, there was a massive amount of destruction. The economies of Japan and Germany, along with lots of other countries, was effectively wiped out. Okay, Germany was tough, right? Because they got wiped out in World War I and then got wiped out again. And again, I'm not arguing morality, right? Some people would say, well, they deserved it. It's like, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, right? But I'm just saying, it's what happened. Their economy got wiped out, and so the nation leaders got together and said, there's an issue here, right? Like some of the old mindsets were like, well, we're gonna put more burden of debt on Germany, right? They gotta pay for this, it's their fault. But they learned from World War I that it didn't really work well because they didn't have an economy to like pay anyone back with. And so they're like, all right, that doesn't work. Let's try a different way. So the Bretton Woods Agreement was like to establish a world bank. And we're going to say, we're going to have, just like every nation has their bank, right? Their central bank. We need to have a unified world bank to help bring some stability here. So let's do that. Where is it going to be? Well, we want it in a spot that's stable. Keep in mind that of all the nations involved in World War II that were like global powers at the time, like the United States was the most stable, right? We didn't really have a conflict on American soil. Again, don't throw rocks at me for this. I know, I mean, Pearl Harbor, right? That's U.S. soil, and there was espionage and blah blah blah. But like, I'm just saying, broad sweeping statements here. The United States did not have the destruction of even our allies, right? Like Great Britain was right across the channel from the war, and they got bombed, they got hammered. And so when comparing the options of the global superpowers at that time, establishing the World Bank looked like the best idea to happen in America, and so they did. So here in the United States is the location of the global bank. And now they said, well, what currency are we going to deal with in the global bank? Because we're going to use this global bank to issue loans to countries to try to stimulate their economies and help them build back up after the war, and then make sure to help just grow humanity, right? We're going to be this player in the global economy to help with this. So like, what currency are we going to use to issue these loans? Well, they wanted it tied to something hard. They wanted it tied to gold, which is smart because gold has intrinsic value, right? It's a precious metal. And so they said, whatever it is, we're going to tie it to gold. And because the United States at that time controlled about 75% of the total global supply of gold, they said, well, we're going to use the US dollar. So everyone said, great, that sounds awesome. We're going to put all the gold in a bank, and the dollar, every dollar is going to represent, at that time it was like 1/35 of an ounce of gold was worth $1, something like that. So every dollar that's printed is going to like, if you wanted to, it was illegal to actually hold gold, right, in the United States. So like, you couldn't really do this, but basically the concept is, if you wanted to, you could go exchange this piece of paper for some amount of gold. Okay, and that worked well for a time. But something interesting happened. Well, before I get into the interesting thing, let me just explain that that's how the United States established its currency as the world reserve currency. Part of that agreement meant that every other country that participated in the World Bank had to be able to exchange in dollars. So they could still have their own currency if they wanted to, but they had to exchange in dollars. And so my wife and I and our kids right now, we've been traveling through Mexico, and we've been to some huge cities like Mexico City and other big cities, but like, we've also been to some really small, towns and villages and communities. And if we've ever had to go exchange money in those small places, odds are that they might only have like one currency or two currencies that they exchange the Mexican peso for, and that's like the US dollar for sure, plus maybe like the euro or something like that. And so if we were to like in those places, they're not exchanging for like the other, like the German mark or something, right? It's like they only offer like a handful of currencies that they exchange in. And so why not? Because like these little towns in Mexico, and Mexico as a country, like doesn't like need to, it doesn't like get them any advantage to start dealing in other currencies, because the global reserve currency is the dollar. And so overnight in 1944, the United States became, it extended its power so much, because now they can print more of their own money, and that money has to be exchanged elsewhere. It's the global currency. All right, so that happened, right? And before the United States, before 1944, the British Empire was the world order, and before them it was Dutch, right? And so you can look in those periods of time and realize that they had their reserve currency. Like the British pound was the reserve currency before World War II, and then before their world order, it was the Dutch currency had the reserve currency. Everyone pretty much dealt in their currency. Now, the interesting thing is this: initially, it was tied to the value of the dollar. But then as the United States began to, loan more money out to, their own citizens, right? Like government loans, but then there's also these issuing loans to other countries trying to repair from World War II. Basically, they could no longer, there was more loans, like more dollars out there than there was gold. So there were, in theory, more people could, there were more people that had claims on gold than there was gold. And that's problematic. I mean, in theory, you don't have everyone exchanging gold at the same time, right? That's what they're betting on. But at some point, they had overextended to the point where people who held dollars with the promise that they could get gold for it started to realize that it was becoming less and less likely that they actually would be able to exchange their money for a gold. And so it led to kind of a run on the bank, right? People are like, well, if there's not enough, like I'm gonna get my piece, right? And so they start trading their money out and getting gold. And so they realized that there was a risk in holding on to that paper money. And so in 1971, it was Richard Nixon who was the president, and he said, you know what? We are no longer going to tie the value of the US dollar to gold. It's not going to happen. And so, like that, and forgive me if it's not 1971, I might have my dates out there, but like 70s era, maybe it was late 70s and into the 80s is when we went through this period of like, holy smokes, like the US dollar, it's not tied to like a hard asset anymore. It's really, it's based on like the financial economy, the supply and demand of the actual dollar itself, rather than a supply or demand of gold, of some hard asset. So that is what's called fiat currency. It's where, like basically what I'm talking about. It's like the currency is no longer tied to a physical asset. It's whatever is mutually agreed upon the value. So that's how it is. But the interesting thing is that because the United States still has the World Bank and the US dollar still is the global reserve currency, every other currency in the world, or at least of all the countries participating in the World Bank, which is most every country, the value of their currency is tied to the dollar. So even though the dollar is not tied to gold anymore, their currency is tied to the dollar. And so we are still able to print money in the global currency, and therefore we can write our own ticket. And we've been doing that, lots of it, trillions of dollars of that. And so the challenge is at some point, by doing that, it devalues the dollar, right? Because you're flooding the world with dollars. And it also devalues other currencies because their value is tied to the dollar. And so it gets less and less stable on a global scale by doing that. And so I'm seeking to explain, as from like a mechanics standpoint in how the world works, is that the value of the dollar is going down. And so what does this matter for you is that you got to think through like an investor. You got to think through like someone who survives the changing world order well, and say, okay, what, like if the dollar doesn't have any intrinsic value, right? It doesn't, it's just a piece of paper, and it only has the value that other people say. Can I exchange it? While times are still okay and relatively good, can I exchange this for assets that actually add value? They have intrinsic value, they are producing. And so the answer is yes, if you know where to look, right? And so let's just take stocks, for example, right? You can invest in lots of different types of companies, lots of different industries. And so some of those companies that you're exchanging dollars for a portion of their company, right? So now you have an asset. And if that company is tied to some like hard production, hard manufacturing, something critical and essential like infrastructure, you know, like if, or maybe it's not stock, that's just this example, right? If you hold on to something that has real hard value, those assets will weather the storm better, right? And we're going to talk more about that in other videos, some ideas and some interesting case studies about what types of companies and assets and vehicles work better. The whole point of this is just to help open your eyes to realize that the way you used to do things in terms of investing, in terms of making money, maybe you're like, you've been into like tech startups, right? And like just concepts and ideas. And I'm not saying that's bad, but like there's a way to get lost in all that and wrapped up into perceived value and not real value. And so when there's a changing world order, we're getting closer and closer to a time where you need to think about real value. In the past, when times are great, yeah, we can talk about perceived value and .com bubbles and real estate bubbles and stuff, and like, yeah, we're fat, dumb, and happy. But those days are fewer and farther between. In fact, there's this time where there's got to be a recorrection, an adjustment. And so I'm sharing these to help you start to think through what types of assets and things perform well when that adjustment occurs. So anyway, thanks for tuning in.